I mean, I think a lot of Ukrainians are a bit shocked about the way the latest peace talks are going. Obviously held in London, the big US politicians, Rubio, etc., are not here. But, obviously what's on the table looks to have some pretty big concessions for Ukraine. Arguably, it could have been written in Moscow, certainly gives Moscow a lot of what it wants. Ukraine not a member of NATO, actual recognition of Crimea, de facto recognition of the lands they've taken in eastern Ukraine. But at the same time, the war has reached a kind of stalemate. I mean, what do you both make of it? Anushka, maybe you go first.
Well, I think it's a really difficult position for Ukraine because on the one hand, they feel under massive pressure to be saying to the US, we're very grateful for what you're doing. We want this to come to an end. We want it to be over. On the other hand, it does look increasingly like they're going to have to bow to quite a lot of the demands of Russia, including at the moment, Russia still not wanting any peacekeeping forces on the ground, although it looks like British and French forces are preparing for that in northern France at the moment. And so it could be, quite grim. Whenever we do on the Peston show, and we've done it a few times, showing you the territory Ukraine had pre-2014, post-2014, and then now, you can just see the sheer size of the, land in which Russia has progressed, 20% of Ukraine. And, I sometimes say to people over this, just imagine if that was the same situation in another country. If you were saying, well, hang on, they've come over 20% of your land and you're going to have to concede that in order to get peace.
Robert, I mean, do you think that this is a really serious kind of proposal point? I mean, is there a possibility of a deal in your view? And obviously, if Ukraine were to go on and fight on, it's clearly going to do so without American help. J.D. Vance has effectively said the US will now walk away unless an agreement can be reached pretty quickly. I mean, do you think there's any prospect of Ukraine fighting on?
So, look, it's all down to the attitude of our Prime Minister, Macron, other European leaders. If you'll forgive me, I'd like to just take a little step back for a moment. It seems to me that what we are witnessing is the sort of tactical ability of Putin. The background to what's happening at this particular second is that Trump's big economic tariff policy, this huge risk he's taken to remake the global economic structure, has more or less collapsed. He talked overnight about massively reducing the tariffs on China. He's backed off trying to coerce the American central bank into cutting interest rates, which he needs to revive the American economy. He's totally humiliated. Markets have basically, bullied him into backing down, and Putin can see that he's in a hole, that this is a deeply embarrassing moment for the American president, and Putin, because he is rather adept at these sorts of awful geopolitical games, has basically now indicated he is ready for a deal in the hope that Trump takes the view, well, if I do get a deal in Ukraine, maybe people won't notice how my big economic initiative has failed. And so, the assessment that Putin is making is that Trump will basically try and bully Kyiv into accepting the kind of deal which, as you and Anushka have pointed out, should be totally unacceptable to any Western democracy. And therefore, it is now all down to European capitals, Starmer, Macron, as I've been saying, to determine whether or not they will give Zelenskyy the reassurance he needs that he will have the resources to fight on, or whether this is the moment where the Western alliance crumbles. It's a very big moment.
Anushka, do you think a deal will be done here ultimately because Zelensky's not going to end up having much choice? Or do, in your view, European leaders have, as Robert says, the will and the determination to fight on?
I mean, I think they have almost a bigger will and determination not to be on the wrong side of Trump again and again from what we've seen. So it becomes a very, very difficult circle for them to square at the moment. And I think they've already moved somewhat in the direction of what America wants on this. Already the talk of what is an acceptable deal is something that would have been unacceptable. Previously, you still obviously get some, pretty strong soundings from parts of Europe. The Polish Prime Minister in particular is, being quite strong. I think the foreign minister was using some particularly strong language there yesterday. But I think, I mean, it's really hard to know for sure. But what I don't think there is mood for is any major rupture with the United States, while, countries are trying desperately to carve out some sort of economic deal that can protect them from the worst of the tariffs. What they don't want to do is completely infuriate Donald Trump, in this case. That said, they will be trying to think of how to kind of almost do both things at once, how they can both protect some of the integrity of Ukraine whilst allowing, both Donald Trump and I guess Vladimir Putin to some extent to feel like they can walk away from this with their own integrity intact. And I think that is a very, very difficult thing to, line to walk down. And I think every time we've talked about this issue, whether it be on the economy or whether it be on defence, we've said that it just can't last, that for Keir Starmer, he can continue walking down that line. At some point, you have to probably step one way or another. Although I do think the language from Ukraine signals at least that they want to find a way to something that would be acceptable. But it feels at the moment like they are a long way from that.
We're at a weird moment, aren't we, really? Because, Trump's barely, I mean, how long has he been in an office? It's felt like a long time, but it's only actually a few months. His economic approval ratings in the US are tanking fast. His overall approval ratings are tanking fast. Even if you're a massive fan of Donald Trump, it's just impossible, it seems to me, to argue that, as Robert said, what he's been doing over the last 2 weeks. I mean, it's impossible to understand even what he's trying to achieve. Is he trying to achieve bringing American manufacturing home or not? Tariffs are on, tariffs are off. Escalates things to China to a ludicrous degree, then has to, as he did yesterday, embarrassingly backtrack. The Chinese are obviously just sitting there thinking, right, well, we just need to hold our nerve here and wait for this guy to fold, which he appears to be doing. I mean, it's just not, it's kind of, as far as anyone can make out, a strategy that makes any sense whatsoever. But I guess I'm interested to know about where you think we are this week. Where does it leave us, Robert? Do you think that, because as Anushka was saying, there are still tariffs outstanding for Europe, for many countries, indeed all countries in the world have tariffs, which they want to negotiate down. I mean, where are we, do you think? We've seen the IMF warning of major negative shocks from the tariffs, slashing Rachel Reeves's growth forecast and all the rest of it. So just talk us through where you think we are this week.
So look, we've got, 70 days left before the 90-day negotiating deadline on individual tariffs expires. So absent, Trump bringing forward that date and acknowledging it's all been a terrible mistake, we've still got some weeks and indeed months of uncertainty, as I've said many times on this podcast and on News at 10, uncertainty is a cancer when it comes to economic confidence. Is deterrent from, it deters, both people with money in the financial markets and real businesses from investing. It deters consumers from making big purchases. And so the uncertainty, sadly, is going to still be with us for a while. But I think within the dreadful noise that Trump generates, one can begin to see, use that cliche, the signal. The signal is, there's two elements. One is he's not remotely in control of events. He holds far fewer cards in all of these negotiations than he thought he did. Markets have basically, as I say, bullied him into backing down, the dumping of the dollar, the selling of US assets, including US government debt. All of this has been incredibly painful for America. Interest rates being paid by the government being forced up, as investors made clear they really didn't like at all the toxic combination of tariff policies that he was trying to implement, plus, at the moment, still the threat of unfunded tax cuts, the sort of Liz Truss risky stuff that he is still, in theory, committed to. Where I think we're heading, therefore, in terms of the other part of the signal, is that I think pretty much all the really big tariffs will be negotiated away. I very much doubt that America will get much in return for that. There was a very interesting story in the Wall Street Journal that said that a part of the trade deal being negotiated with the UK would be an agreement that America hopes that tariffs on American exports to the UK, American exports of cars to the UK, would fall from a 10% tariff we currently levy to 2.5%. I mean, truthfully, A, we're not such a huge market. B, the idea that suddenly British people are going to be buying vast numbers of American cars with a tariff falling from 10 to 2.5, it's for the birds. I mean, this is gesture negotiations, to be clear. But I do think we are likely to be stuck globally with Trump's 10% tariff, because it, raises some useful money for him at a time when he desperately needs money. But 10% is not lethal for global trade, and it's not, it's manageable by most exporting businesses. So if we end up at 10%, it's not great for the world. Growth will still be a little bit slower for a number of years, but we can live with it.
Anushka.
I mean, just a kind of word of caution on approval ratings and so on. Not that they aren't falling, they are falling, but they're not falling quite as dramatically as you might think. So, for example, it's gone from 47% at his inauguration down to 42% approval overall in one poll. In another poll, the move was even smaller than that. It is true that on the economy, people who disagree with Trump are now outnumbering the people who agree with him, but there's still a lot of people in America who agree with him. I was listening to a bunch of voters in Michigan the other day, some of them traditional Democrats who worked in the car industry, and they were pretty surprised by some of the tariffs. They weren't expecting so many different tariffs to different parts of the world, the previous thing, but there was still this sense among a lot of people I was listening to, well, at least he's trying something. The Democrats didn't try anything. Now, we can all disagree on the actuality of whether that's reasonable or not. But what I would just say is that the way a lot of the world feels about tariffs isn't the way the entirety of America feels about tariffs. And there is this sense that, there was a massive problem with manufacturing, and is he trying to at least do something about it? Now, obviously, there are 100 arguments as to why slapping on tariffs in this way isn't doing something about it. And I've also heard loads of small business owners, talk about the fact that tariffs on China have completely put American businesses, on the brink of bankruptcy. So it is obviously more complicated than that. But I just think, just a pause that he's not going to necessarily be seen exactly in the same way across the US as he is across the rest of the world. And so one of the big issues will be, where does he finally come out of this at the end? I mean, we can remember at the point at which he dropped most of the reciprocal tariffs. There was this sort of sense in America, see, it was the art of the deal all along. He was a complete genius. And obviously we have yet to see whether that is the case or not. I thought it was quite funny yesterday when Joel Hills, our colleague at the IMF, actually put to the IMF economists, could Trump actually be a genius, basically? Do you think that he knew about this all along? Which I noticed mainly got a laugh in the room and no answer. But it does just make me wonder. I just think a tiny bit of caution on how Americans are changing their opinions on him. And I think in America, the other issue is that the Democrats are still a little bit all over the place. Like, you get a very different response to the tariffs from, say, the governor of Michigan than you do from some of the congressmen and women from other parts of the country. And I don't think there's no clear leader, obviously, and there isn't at the moment a very clear argument against him within the domestic political scene there.
I think just one final point on this. I thought the interesting thing in the polling, you're quite right to inject a note of caution. I think part of the reality of it, of course, which we all understand, is that Trump's vote is, core vote is very, very solid. And it's extremely hard to eat into that because they will support him in almost anything he did. The one thing I did think was interesting was that the drop has really been quite dramatic, obviously, amongst the relatively small number of independent voters that got him over the line to win the presidency. Now, I guess, they were people who voted for him largely, I would say, on economics. That certainly seemed to be the data, and who did so hoping he would deal with inflation and all the rest of it. Now, maybe if the economy stabilizes again, some of those people will come back to him. But it did seem to be quite dramatic, the shift in that not very numerous but politically significant group.